Good afternoon and welcome to Students First, Equity, Access and Opportunity in Higher Education Book Talk. I'm excited for this very important and timely conversation today. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Bridget Terry Long, Dean and Sari's Professor of Education and Economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. A member of the HGSE faculty since 2000, Dean Long also served as academic dean from 2013 to 2017. She will introduce today's author shortly. I would also like to remind all of you to enter your questions into the Q&A feature, which will be active throughout the event. Today, to begin, I will turn it over to Dean Long. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayanne, and welcome everyone. Welcome to this book talk, whether it is afternoon, morning, or night. It's wonderful to have you here. And I'm very, very happy to welcome our guest, Paul Leblanc. He is well known for his influence and innovation in higher education, particularly as it relates to the shift to online learning. Since becoming president of Southern New Hampshire University in 2003, Paul has led the institution as it has grown from serving 2,800 students to over 170,000 learners. Today, it is the largest nonprofit provider of online education in the country. And Paul has been named one of the most influential people in higher education by Forbes magazine. Washington Monthly named him one of America's 10 most innovative university presidents. Paul previously served as a senior policy advisor to Undersecretary Ted Mitchell at the U.S. Department of Education, where he worked on competency-based education, new accreditation pathways, and innovation. And I'm so grateful that he's joining us today. Paul has been a frequent contributor and a close friend to HGSE, participating as a special speaker in many of our classes, serving as a member of the HGSE visiting committee, and always being willing to lend a helpful ear and his expertise as we at GSE have navigated remote education, especially during the last 18 months. Paul has been such a good friend. So please join me in welcoming him. We're so excited to hear more about his book, Students First, Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education. Now, before I give Paul a few minutes to give us some opening comments, I just want to thank him for giving me the honor of writing the foreword for the book. It was wonderful to see some of the early chapters and drafts. And just to provide a bit of framing for our conversation, you know, it was long before the pandemic when the world really started to question whether or not American higher education was worth it. American higher education and higher education actually around the world has been under fire with foundational questions such as, well, what really is a college education and is college worthwhile? It's become clear that completion rates, particularly in American higher education, are weak overall and outright dismal for some groups of students. And while the US has some of the best institutions in the world, it also fails a large number of students. And so this was the backdrop for, as we were thinking about American higher education, as many of us entered the COVID pandemic. And it was around the first wave of impacts, if you think back to spring 2020, when many of us all of a sudden abruptly closed our campuses and were sent home. And at that time, in April 2020, I invited Paul to be a part of a webinar that HGSE hosted that spring. Now, at the time, many colleges were being forced to dismantle their usual models. All of our assumptions were being questioned. And Paul, I think, has provided a really helpful and needed seasoned perspective on how institutions can navigate these challenges and adapt to evolving conditions. And what I love about this book, putting students first as we go through this tumultuous time, this could actually be an opportunity. It could actually be an opportunity for colleges and universities to rethink what they're doing, because as we've seen in the last 18 months, change is possible. And so as higher education confronts increased scrutiny and doubt in the midst of all of this uncertainty, I know that Paul's insights are sorely needed. And so please join me in welcoming Paul Leblanc. Paul?
Bridget, thank you so much for having me. HGSE is one of my favorite places in American higher ed, so it's been just great fun over the years to be paying visits on a routine basis and spending time with you and your team, your colleagues. And among those colleagues, I have particular thanks. Well, first to you, because the forward is probably the best part of the book. So thank you for that piece. Secondly, the whole team at Harvard Education Press, Jane and my editor, and Laura, who's dealing with marketing, and Roseanne with publicity, have just been a delight to deal with throughout. And then a little bit of a disclaimer. As you know, I've been traveling, and I came home from Europe to discover that I needed, at the age of 64, an emergency wisdom tooth extraction yesterday. And I thought, oh my God, what kind of shape will I be in? But it went easily, and but I thought I was past the post-anesthesia loopiness. And a little earlier today, my wife asked for a cup of coffee, and I apparently delivered to her an empty coffee cup and an empty water glass. But I think it's finally worn off. But I'm gonna have a little bit of a disclaimer. If I say anything too goofy, I'm gonna blame it on anesthesia. It's a delight to be here, and thank you for your kind comments about the book. It's really born less of the more immediate pressures of the pandemic, which I think cast a very harsh light on all kinds of issues in higher education. But as you said in your comments, we've been talking about these for a while. And my own sort of story for higher education is that I'm a first generation immigrant college kid whose parents had 8th grade educations when we came to the United States from really kind of French Canadian Appalachia, as how I might describe it, a very hard scrabble sort of farming village where it was very hard to eke out a living. And we immigrated and ended up in the Boston area. But my access to high quality, affordable education absolutely changed the trajectory of my life. My mom cleaned houses in the exclusive Tony suburb of Weston, Mass. And I remember I learned to read English. French was my first language as a Canadian, but learned to read English in the libraries of these homes as she was vacuuming and cleaning, etc. And for her, college was really for the kids who lived in those homes, not for us. And it was a 6th grade teacher who once said to her during a parent-teacher conference, I think Paul could go to college someday. And it was like a lightning bolt, and she held on to that dream. It's a very corny, I'm almost schmaltzy about this. I have such a deep-seated belief in the American dream as I experienced it, but having worked in this industry for a long time now and watched what we've done to students, whether it's the 45% failure rate in terms of students who start but don't stop, the 37 million Americans who have some credits and no degree, but a lot of debt. That debt is now $1.6, $1.7 trillion. That's more than all bodies of debt in America except for home mortgages. But it's more than all credit card debt put together. So if you think about that, you think about the acceptance rates of schools and what they were. Jeff Salingo, longtime higher ed journalist, has just did a piece this morning about digging out old records of acceptance rates at places like Harvard and MIT, et cetera, which were in the 30 percentile, and now, as you know, in the sort of middle single digits. When I sort of think about all of that, I wonder if a recent immigrant kid from Afghanistan or the Dominican Republic or parts of Central America has access to that opportunity. And mine was also based in race and privilege. It comes with that, even though I didn't know it at the time. But do they have a similar opportunity that I have? And the answer to that has been, to my mind, no. And we need to fix that. And that really was the genesis of the book. And happy to just jump right in.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that. And I want to let everyone know in the audience that later on during this hour, we'll be opening up to questions. So please do use the Q&A tool to submit your questions all along the way. And so, Paul, thanks so much for sharing more about your own story. I think so many of us are motivated in this work because of our own personal stories. But the book opens up with a story about one student in a conversation you had with her. It seems that encounter really stayed with you. And so I wonder if you might share it and say a little bit about why it was so important.
Yeah, it opens the book, as you said. It's the beginning of chapter 1, and it's a story of a woman named Miriam, not her real name, but she comes from one of the poorest neighborhoods of Boston, single mom at the time, a 7-year-old daughter with chronic respiratory illness. And she had just enrolled in a program that we had started in partnership with then Duet in Boston. And in that, and when I met her and I looked at her transcripts, she had gone to both Roxbury Community College and Bunker Hill Community College, and her transcripts were littered with W's and F's. And asked her about this because on paper she looked like, "Are we sure we're ready for this?" And those courses were only a year ago, and what's different? And And she went on to describe how every time her little girl got sick, she would have to miss class for a week or longer. And if it was early enough in the semester, she would take the withdrawal because she'd fall behind. And if it was too late, she would take the F. And of course, every time she took an F, she was bringing down her Pell Grant cap of financial aid dollars. So when we put her into a program that was not tethered to time and place, where she could actually hit the pause button, she actually flourished. She was really smart and she was gritty and she raced to an associate's degree. And I thought about that in that conversation. She said to me at one point, you know, I don't have to conform to someone else's schedule. I'm the schedule. I set the schedule. And I thought to myself, we didn't have somebody who was ill-suited for higher ed. We gave her a higher ed that was ill-suited for her, that wasn't able to sort of put her first and understand what she would need from it. So that really set me off on this inquiry into the role of time as a source of inequity in education. Because in Miriam's case, and so many of the students with whom we work, you know, as you know, Bridget, time is itself a privilege, and poor people, low-income people, tend to have less of it and less control of it. So if you don't have a washer dryer down the hall the way you and I do, it just takes longer to have clean clothes for you and your kids. If you don't have a car, it takes longer to get groceries in the fridge. If you don't have good employer health care, it takes longer to get health care. And yet and if you work a retail job, or if you work a frontline, fast food job, you may not even know what your schedule is 2 weeks from now. But then when we tell you have to be in such and such hall at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, that gets really hard. And I think time is an inadvertent source of inequity. And yet we have built our whole industry on the credit hour. Time as a measurement of learning, time as a way of scheduling student time as a way of measuring progress, time as a way of allotting faculty workload, time as a way of allotting classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. And that really sort of moved me into a deeper inquiry into how do we rethink that, especially for the populations we're interested in serving.
Right, absolutely. Just with the start there, you're pointing out something that works against students. And so I remember being on a project and talking with a foundation who was trying to get employers just to have regular set work hours and what impact that would have for working students. Although, you know, if you talk to many colleges and universities, if you look at their materials or websites, they would say that they're already putting students first. But how does your book challenge higher education to think differently about students?
Yeah, and I think they believe that, and they believe it with sort of authenticity. And I think if you talk to our colleagues throughout our industry, it's rare for me to meet somebody in higher education who doesn't care deeply about students. But then if I take a look at the kinds of things that we just shared, right? The failure rates, the amount of debt we ask students to take on, the sacrifices that they make. If you take a look at the way that we build curriculum in a kind of one size fits all, so that if you and I as undergraduates go to institution X and enroll in the same major, it's kind of oblivious to what we bring, right? There's nothing about that sort of learning experience. There's not a lot about that learning experience as a just around us. Never mind the other constraints that we may live with, how many more hours I may need to work. As a first generation student, am I made to feel welcome? As a student of color, am I made to feel like I belong, that I'm part of this community? I think of the work of Greg Elliott at Brown University, who led them to create a Center for First Generation Students. And I know they've connected with Harvard and others. And I think for many of our institutions, getting someone in feels like the win, and that's just table stakes. And I think what we have to do then is think about, what does it mean to help someone be successful? And I've had very painful experiences of making that same mistake myself. And how do we support students? And then I think, you know, if you look at something as simple as scheduling, as the kind of administrative processes, if you take a look at the administrative burdens we impose on students, like the Fafsa is better designed to keep people out than in.
Right.
And really, and some people would argue, Sarah Goldrick-Robb would argue, by intention, right? That we built higher education was a system of privilege. So if we're going to help you, we're going to make it hard to get that help and get in. So I think permeating our industry are ways that we essentially communicate that students are not in fact first, but that our institutional values, status, what we care about most actually carries precedence. So, and an easy example for almost every young faculty member in America is what gets you tenure faster, scholarship in books or really being great in the classroom? And what we know is the answer is almost everywhere, scholarship and books and research. And we need great research, right? Higher education isn't just for one thing, but to the extent that I'm concerned about the students that are being left behind in America, it really has to be built around that. And I think our systems don't support it. I don't think that's what there's no status derived from it. It's not what we reward. It's not where the money flows. I'm telling you what you know well.
Yes. And, when you think about the bulk of students and what they're confronting and this bureaucracy that they're trying to somehow figure out how to access. And so in my own work, saying, common sense and simple reasoning and logic would not help you figure out how to get through the system that is built in such a way that, quite frankly, makes no sense at all. And you brought up the Fafsa, which of course I've done a great deal of work on. Mm-hmm. And I remember with my own research, when we documented, when you simplify the form, when you give assistance, how many more people went to college. So of course, the policymakers would say, oh, well, they must have dropped out immediately. I said, no, absolutely not. They were persisting for 3 years. So the skills somehow that you needed to do well in college were different than the skills you needed to actually fill out the form.
Right.
And that's just crazy that we are wasting this incredible potential and opportunity because of a form that was not designed with any clear educational purpose in mind.
That's right.
Quite frankly.
That's right. And I might extend that, Bridget, and this is hardly original, but I really come to a place in my career where I wonder about grades as a sort of, instrument of power and a lot of other things, but not of actual learning. And in fact, we know the lots of problems with grade and grade inflation, et cetera, et cetera. I think you could look sort of throughout the texture of what we do and find lots of reasons to argue we don't actually put students first.
Well, let me, before we start talking about solutions, let's talk about what's the root cause problem? How did we become so reliant on time?
So if you think about scale, and we have a massively scaled industry in total, the ability to do things efficiently in a highly structured, scalable way moves you against the kind of personalization that I think is so important in learning. And we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but I'm really working on a project now where I'm looking at this across various industries. And the thing that, to be very effective, whether it's mental health, whether it's healthcare generally, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's incarcerated, and whether it's higher education, is you can't cheat the amount of time that's required in interpersonal relations, right? But when you're doing things at scale, everything gets easier if I can sort of segment, schedule. It's an industrial age model, and it serves very well. Like I used the examples earlier, if I need to work out a schedule for all of my faculty, well, then the credit hour kind of works beautifully. And by the way, as you know, the origins of the credit hour was really simply how to pay people pensions. It was the Carnegie unit was an attempt to figure out an equitable way to pay retired faculty their pensions. But it's come to permeate everything. So it's how we organize the schedule. It's how we measure student progress. It's how we tell if someone's a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. It's how we do workload and workload releases. So it's really an effective instrument in that respect. It's pretty good at telling you how long someone sat in the classroom. It's pretty lousy at telling you what someone's actually learned. It's not a good measurement of learning. But it's like the Higgs boson particle now of higher ed, right? It's like dark matter that holds the universe together. It's everything. And time becomes fixed in our world and learning becomes variable. And that I think is deeply problematic. So it's pervasive in that sense at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think I may have written about this a little bit in the foreword. I think one of the fundamental problems has been higher education hasn't figured out a good way to measure learning. So I'm going to want to ask you a question about that we've relied on things like grades or test scores, and we've relied on things like rankings because we haven't quite figured out how to get inside the black box of actual learning. There have been several attempts to do so, but I think higher ed has really struggled with that. So it keeps going back to time, this measure of time. So I'd love to think in a much more forward-looking way. How can we get out of that box? How do we start to measure things and start to really pay attention to learning, which is actually the goal?
So I've been a big proponent, as you mentioned in passing, of competency-based education, and that's very central to this book. And I think sometimes competency-based education is heard or lands with people as an argument for a kind of pedagogy or a structure of curriculum or an approach to the learning. And I like to argue that it's simply an underlying architecture that asks you two questions fundamentally, no matter what you're teaching, whether it's philosophy or coding, which is, what are the claims you make for what students can do with what they've learned? So it's a performative question. And then the assessment is, how do you know? And we come back because it's the hardest part. And in the book, I think the chapter on assessment is the hardest part. But first, you can't really get into a meaningful conversation about assessment unless you know what you're assessing. And higher education is pretty uneven in terms of the claims it makes for learning. Now, in places where our lives matter, we do this pretty well. So doctors, nurses, airline pilots, like, we care a lot. And we're not going to rely on your credit hours. We're not going to rely on your GPA. We're going to rely on putting in time under the watchful eye of somebody. So those are your clinicals, if you're a doctor or a nurse. Those are your residency. We're going to probably subject you to national licensing exams. We do that in all of those professions that I talked about. And we don't trust the undergraduate and even the graduate experience fully, because we want to make sure that you can do the right things with what you've learned along the way. So if I think of that example and think there's a certain kind of rigor, and there's also a sort of case here for how we do assessment in this case. But I've been challenged by a philosophy professor who says, wait a minute, I understand competency-based education. Like, if you're a programmer, if you're a software engineer, your code either compiles or it doesn't. There's a kind of performative aspect that we can measure. But I teach philosophy. What am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to assess? What kind of claim am I supposed to make? Someone joked, am I supposed to have my students prove or disprove the existence of God? Is that what they're going to do? And how will I know? I said, let's flip that a little bit. Why does McKinsey recruit from the philosophy departments of the best universities in the country? Because your students actually can do things that they put an enormous value on. They can think critically. They can think about, they use logic systems. They understand symbols. They're good in communication, right? Like, they know things. Like, own those claims, and then show how you should, and show how they can demonstrate that. Find ways for them to demonstrate that. Fundamentally, CBE only asks those two questions. It doesn't argue for a way of teaching. It isn't an argument against courses versus something else, but it does force you to be very thoughtful about the claims you make. And then it really does move you to authentic assessment. So project-based learning, demonstrated abilities to do things, performative learning. And those are hard, as you know, and they can be expensive and elaborate to create. But you do have places like, just down the road, Worcester Polytech is really well known for its project-based learning, has a center for project-based learning. We're trying to do more and more of that in our own engineering curriculum and other places. I think there is a way forward on this. Here's the problem in some part. Okay. It's more demanding. Right? When we go against that sort of budgeting and efficiency and scalability question, it's more demanding. It's more demanding of students. I actually think that if we were to wave the wand and tomorrow move to that kind of authentic assessment, we would actually see persistence and graduation rates plummet for a while, because we'd all be like, wait a minute, our students don't actually know how to do what we claim, and that would be a rude awakening.
Well, let's talk about the role of faculty. I mean, students may not be prepared for this. I'm not sure if faculty are prepared for this. I think this does have implications for our teaching or how we approach our teaching. On the positive foot, though, when we needed to flip all of our classes to remote at HGSE, but I heard this really across American higher education, also K through 12, it caused instructors to take a moment and say, wait, what are my learning goals? What do I want students to do or learn? To prioritize things. You heard this again and again and again, where oftentimes courses had to change drastically, but they ensured that the core goals were going to be met. And it changed conversations about learning goals rather than just going through courses. So there, I think that's the first step in thinking of a new system and thinking about competencies and thinking about students first. What do we want to get out of out of this. I wonder if you agree, or at least have some optimism, or, will we continue to benefit from those conversations, or do you think that was just a short blip?
No, I don't think it's a blip. I think I'm actually pretty optimistic. And in some ways, I feel like I sort of started on such a sort of downer note. I actually think we have to get to this level of broken in some ways to do the fundamental fixes that we need. So I think this is an enormous opportunity. I think, there will be, I have some of my presidential colleagues who can't wait to get back to normal and they will rush back, but I don't think that's the norm necessarily. And we see this in this enormous growth in online programs. And I think, institutions are thinking very deeply about, can we move to a place where we give students more, I've been using sort of fluidity as the word, a more fluid kind of learning experience where today I might be online, tomorrow I may be on campus, I can go back and forth more seamlessly. There are real challenges in that, of course, but I think it's very exciting. And I think it moves us closer to a student-centered model that says to a student, what works best for you in this moment? I think, I love that one of the things that we heard again and again in institutions during the pandemic was, don't jump into the material, start with them. How are you today, Bridget? Like, are you doing okay? Is your family okay? Like, it got us back to a relational conversation first. And you saw, I think, a shifting of what was important. And that move to online learning, it's a little bit, you and I share a love of travel. And when you are in a different framework and environment, the things you take for granted at home every day, you said, oh, wait a minute, is this like, am I doing this right? And it forced everyone who had to then teach in this new way to kind of stand back and go, wait a minute, I can't fall back on my old sort of ways. And it did invigorate in a really exciting way. It's not the way we would have chosen, of course, but I share with you a kind of optimism that we can see dramatic change happening. I also think, and again, I don't want to keep harping on CB, even though it's very central to the book, that we saw, like MOOCs, this kind of Gartner curve where CB a few years ago was going to change the world. And then everyone said, oh God, that was a disappointment, just like the MOOCs. But just like MOOCs, which have continued to grow and expand, and now a pretty big presence, if you think about, edX being purchased for 800 million, and Coursera's continued to grow, and these are legitimate players in our ecosystem. CB programs are proliferating across the country. I'm going to be at the CB conference next week talking about this book. And it's, it's scores and scores of institutions that are now doing CB programs across, and they're grappling with all the questions we're talking about.
Okay, well, that's great. I think there is lots of reason for optimism and what you saw happen in classrooms, and hopefully what will continue. But that's kind of on the front end and thinking about what are the learning goals and how do we engage and put our students first. But what about the back end? What will it take, and what will faculty need or institutions need to support their faculty to get to some kind of competency-based kinds of measures to really get to learning? Because that seems to be a much more difficult nut to crack.
Yeah, and you're seeing it happen first in technical fields and in healthcare, where a lot of the sort of claims for learning have been worked out. I think it's going to come slowest to the humanities, which is really much more in that sense of, when you leave me, I don't really have a lot of conversation with you about what you can do when you leave me. So I do think that's where it's going to be a sort of migration across the institution. I think the ways we can help faculty is in fact sort of standing up, and I offer some case studies that include, schools of theology that have moved to a CBE model. I think we need to offer them models. I think we need to offer support. This is the hard work. I think we can get to the competency side of this pretty readily because most faculty are used to writing the outcomes for their course. You're halfway there. When you're talking about outcomes, you're halfway there. Now let's talk about what people can do. That's an evolution. I think it's on the assessment side that's going to be really challenging because there's an over-reliance still today in American higher education on sort of the test, the multiple choice test. It's sort of appalling how much of that goes on. When I was at the Department of Ed, I asked AIR to come in and do a primer for the department staff on the state of higher education assessment. And they're sort of headlined, and it wasn't exactly these words, but it was close, somewhere between dismal and awful. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, why do you say that? Well, it's like, in terms of reliability, viability, like all of the sort of science of assessment, it falls far short. And it's essentially, in many instances, a kind of faculty writing assessments about themselves, because how the students fared is a reflection, of course, on how they performed, some would argue. So we have a long way to go to think about how we do assessments. And I think but we also have well-established programs now that are doing this. And I think we can point to, I mentioned WPI. Western Governors University is an institution as large as us, and it's been doing, and that's all CB, and they're very, very good at it. So we have the knowledge base now, and it's growing fast.
Right. That's good. That's wonderful. I just want to remind the audience that we will be taking your questions in just a few minutes. So please do use the Q&A tool if you have a question. Paul, I wonder if, you've mentioned, so obviously Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors, these are big, established, seasoned institutions in moving forward this work. But you mentioned that the book also has case studies. I wonder if you might share a little bit about a school that did this perhaps unexpectedly. What if you are an institution? What if you are a leader, a faculty member, where this is quite new? Is there a case study you would highlight as being maybe perhaps what we wouldn't expect?
Yeah, well, I think the School of Theology I mentioned, South Carolina, is sort of a wonderful example, and they were thinking a lot about their producing their graduating ministers who go out into these communities, and then they sort of grappled with the question of what does it mean to minister to a congregation? What are the things that you need to know? And what are the skills you need to bring, the proficiencies you need to bring? And what they knew intuitively, but they hadn't sort of backed out of, was the movement from thinking about, we're going to teach the Old Testament, we're going to teach this. Now you're going to see my layperson's understanding of the Old theology. We teach the New Testament, we're going to teach comparative religion, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of knowledge, right? You're going to get some Hebrew, you're going to get some Greek. But what does it mean to be at someone's bedside when they're dying? What does it mean to counsel a couple who are going through a rocky patch in their marriage? What does it mean to organize the finances and budget of your church, which may be hanging on by a thread? Like, these are the things that they weren't doing. And then they talked about, how do you take all of this deep knowledge of the sorts of things that I described a moment ago? How do you translate that into a population if you're in a rural population? How do you make those connections? How do you make that knowledge meaningful? So they started articulating, look at the competencies that they were seeing and talking to their graduates who said, you go out to the world and say, you graduated 5 years ago. What do you wish we had taught you that you had to learn on your own? That's a sobering moment. And by the way, I'm giving you, something that people don't tend to think about with CB. This is true of fields like nursing. Like, if you talk to the folks at Providence Health, the third largest healthcare system in America, they actually can't put new graduated nurses onto the floor. They have an internal academy that's of X number of weeks before they feel like those nurses are genuinely competent to be with patients. So this is a need that we can sort of work through across our industry. And it's what employers have long wanted from us. And I know we can fall into a trap of thinking, higher ed, it's all about jobs, because that is in some ways the problem we're being asked to most solve for these days: jobs, workforce alignment, et cetera. But obviously it's about a lot more, but this is one where I think we have to get into a closer working alignment. And that means we have to be in conversation with the way our graduates are doing their work. Right.
Great. In just a minute, I am going to start taking questions from the Q&A, but before we get there, I want to ask one question on behalf of our students at HGSE. So, as you know, we have many students who are interested in higher education, some who are coming with some administrative experience, some who are hoping to go and work for colleges and universities, very much motivated by a number of the things that you've been talking about, putting students first, helping students who are coming from backgrounds that have traditionally been marginalized. If you are a person who is in the earlier parts of your career, Paul, I wonder what advice would you give them as they're just kind of entering this higher education industry and they want to make change?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I get asked it a lot. I mean, I think we hire a lot of people, and the trait that I've come to look for most now is curiosity, inquisitiveness, someone who is really asking the question all the time, how can this be better? I do think that, and I've met so many of the students at HGSE, and I see this range, right? There are some who want to work in an institution that looks like the one that they went to as an undergraduate, and perhaps it's an elite selective institution, and that, so you have to kind of know where your batteries are getting charged. And I have met others who, when I talk about the student, I was like, I want to work with that student. Like, how do I invent a system that like works for her? So be honest with yourself about what job I'm going to use Clay Christensen's term, what job are you trying to do with your work, right? What is the job that's being asked of you or that you're asking of yourself? But if you're interested in the population that I think about so often, I often say we serve the 45% of Americans who would struggle to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair. Like if you're interested in that population, I think you really, we have this in our sort of vision statement, no sacred cows, right? Always challenging the status quo. And for us, that means someone who's, inquisitive leadership, always asking questions. How can we do this better? How can we do it differently? And again, to the sort of spirit of this book, and this is in every single conference room at SNHU, and this is not an SNHU commercial, but it tells you something about what we look for. In every single conference room and meeting room is a sign that says, are the decisions we made here today good for our students? And that is a grounding question. And if that's the question that's of interest to you, then I think that's not saying, what would I do? It's like what I would engender is learn everywhere you can, be an active learner. Bridget, you know this, and I don't know if this is more true at Harvard than anywhere else, but I think this is true across higher ed. This is an expert culture where status accrues to those who know the most. So it's very hard for people in higher ed to say, I don't know, or I need help, because it's an admission of something less than this perfect standard that we have. And yet we live in a world where we don't know right now how society will be impacted by the pandemic. We don't know, right? All I know is student behaviors are changing, but I don't actually quite know in what ways. We know there's been a massive exodus from higher education. We know that worker behavior, employee behavior has changed. We're in the middle of, we don't know. Like if we're not asking a lot of questions, if you go into this, if you're a leader, if you or I are leaders with certitude, boy, are we on dangerous ground. We need to be inquisitive and curious. Absolutely. And I think that's true at every level of the institution.
Thank you. And anyone who's listening, I would absolutely emphasize the curiosity piece, the always trying to figure out how to make things better. Unfortunately, I will say that also might get you into a job as dean if you ask too many questions and show too much curiosity and wanting to solve problems, and then all of a sudden you find yourself on a different pathway. But I absolutely agree, and I think that rules the day, even so more than a person's formal training, because there's so much you can do with curiosity and drive and dedication. So let's go to some of the questions I've gotten in the Q&A. The first question asks about a particular population of students that we know struggle with so much. I think it's hard for so many students when they're just dealing with themselves. But what about single parents who are also college students? Your very first story, a noted parent. Do you have any advice, or are there particular places other than Southern New Hampshire that you might lift up, or advice you would give to students who are single parents, what they should look for, the kinds of places that would be supportive for them?
Yeah, so I think when we ask this question, we generally go right to residential campuses, and the other question often becomes a question of simply daycare. Like, I need that help, and I don't mean simply, it's hard, and there's a fair bit of conversation about that question. But I do think that, it's about 13% of American college students are attending residential campuses full time. It is now the minority of students, and everyone else is everywhere else. And I do think that what I would urge people to look for, and this really goes back to my question of time, you need to look for time flexible programs. The reason that so many students enroll with us online is that they're not tethered to time. They are sort of tethered still to a schedule. So I don't want to pretend we don't have a term. Most of our students are in a term structure. But when they sign on, I will say the example is I work all day, I got to pick up my kids, I maybe have soccer practice, I get them fed, put them to bed. And then if it's 9:30 at night and the house is quiet, I make a cup of tea and put on my big furry slippers and I log on, I am now a student for the next couple of hours. That's a far different experience for a working parent than, oh no, you have to be at your night class at 7 p.m. What do I do about my kid? How do I arrange daycare, right? So the asynchronous
kids, I will just say, are a little bit unpredictable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And every day is different.
Every day is different. You're living this, but I do think, for us, the asynchronous aspect of our online programs is what's worked, and it's why you've seen this mass migration for adult learners, our non-traditional learners, if you like. But here's what's really interesting, Bridget. If you had asked me 10 years ago who enrolls in an SNHU online course, I would have said a 30-year-old, 86% of them had credits from prior. 86% were working, 80% had credits, half of them had kids, etc. So that's kind of the classic working adult. Today, we have 30,000 students between the ages of 17 and 22. That tells me that for a lot of students, traditional age students not going to a campus, that kind of flexibility is really critical because they're working, they're helping take care of their families. They may be parents already. So the big question here is, as you think about if you're advising someone who is in that situation, who has kids, look for programs that have time flexibility because that's your biggest deficit more than anything else.
Right, right. I completely agree. And I also want to underscore, even students who are not formally parents, as we learn more and more, they're part of family systems where they're providing support perhaps to their parents or to siblings. It's always complicated. And so there's so many things that students are wrapped up and involved in trying to support along the way too. So it ends up being complicated, I think, for all. But another great question. So SNHU, obviously very focused on online education. You guys have been doing it for years. One thing I think that HGSE and other institutions have struggled with, we've learned how to provide very strong online courses and have engagement and supports and breakout rooms. But I'm wondering, what do you do to help your students connect and engage beyond just their classes?
Yeah, so again, it varies greatly with the student. So I want to be very careful about generalizing. We have some students like, give me the right class, get out of my way. I've got a limited amount of time. I'm hyper scheduled and I just don't need anything else. And then there are others who like, I didn't get to go to college and this is a big deal. And I want like as rich an experience as possible. So more for the latter, I would say that we've really built out, and it's a pretty large team that does all of the sort of clubs and affinity groups. There's a student government group. So there are things that approximate or look like what you might expect on a college campus. Disciplinary affiliations are really important. So if I'm an accounting student and I live in Dallas and I'm enrolled at SNHU, who else is in my area? Who else am I connecting with? We do a lot more through B2B. So we're working with a lot of large scale employers like Walmart, like Disney, like HCL, which is a large Indian tech company, which is expanding in North America, doing more with a healthcare company now. And there we're trying to sort of create an employee affinity group. So again, if I'm at work and I have the same lunch break, hey, Bridget, are you working on, can we just get together and like brown bag it and talk about this? Because I'm really struggling with this particular project. So all of that. But honestly, the secret sauce for us is actually the relationship of students to their advisors, to their academic coaches. And the academic, remember I said you can't shortchange time? The place where we address that at scale is in the relationship with you and your coach who's with you through your journey. And it's an intimate relationship in most cases, because I get to know you, I get to know like that you have X number of kids, who's struggling at school, that work has been taught, whatever it is. Because even though we call them academic coaches, it's really probably 20% academics, making sure you're in the right course, you have this prerequisite, et cetera, et cetera. And it's 80% intervening when you throw your hands up one night and go, oh, I can't get this. Maybe it wasn't college material after all. Maybe this isn't for me, or you've had a really bad week. And we undergird all of that effort with a very powerful set of CRM, customer relationship management system, and a lot of data. So we're monitoring our students 24/7. We do predictive analytics on their performance. We know when you sort of perform less well than you probably should have on a given exam. When that advisor comes in the morning, that's coming up on their screen like, you need to reach out to Bridget. So it's a proactive advising model. And I get to say, hey, Bridget, it seems like that exam was a little tougher than maybe you thought. You get to say, oh my God, what a week I had. My kids were sick, all the stuff. I'll get back on track. Don't worry about me, I'm good. And I know as an advisor, like, oh yeah, she's good, I can tell. But you might also say, I can't do this. I don't get it. And we know that in that moment is the difference maker. That conversation is the difference today between you dropping out or staying in. Or it may be, I'm falling behind on my rent and we have a whole big emergency fund and that advisor is empowered to send you a check. It's a very empowered advising model. God, my computer's driving me crazy. It won't do this thing it's supposed to do because it's 10 years old. Hey, look, we'll get that. We have to get that taken care of, but let me put a Chromebook in the mail to you tonight. I'll get it FedEx. You'll have it tomorrow to have it in time for your assignment. So we really learned a lot from Zappos and other companies about how they do customer service. And we don't even like to use that phrase in higher ed, right? Like no one talks about customer service in higher ed. Like we're probably an example of terrible. But so we just call it student success, student support in that respect. But when we looked at our CARES Act request for emergency funds, what was number one? Food insecurity. Number two, housing insecurity.
Mhm.
It was surprising how bad the numbers were. When we looked at our traditional age students, because we do have a campus, and we saw Black students, mostly Black students, online at 3 a.m. Like, what's going on? Like, I know kids stay up late, but 3 a.m. when our teams reached out, crowded apartment, it's the only quiet time they had. There was one family computer. Their younger siblings were on it in the evening, so they get it late, right? And so we shipped out hotspots and Chromebooks, et cetera. So sorry, long meandering answer, but there's so much we can do about this. And for us, I've been consumed with this question about how do you put human beings back at the center of systems at scale? Because so many of our systems dehumanize people. I think we often dehumanize students, frankly, in higher education. And I think that the heart of that is a relational answer.
Great. Fantastic. You've given so many great examples, and I can see you're using your data to constantly evolve and get better. And you're also dealing with an incredibly diverse population. So a general question I have that I think all institutions, regardless of where you are in the institution, are grappling with is, how do you know when you're doing a good job? How do you know when, okay, we've got a practice that works, I can now move to the next problem? Or, because particularly when you have a diverse student body, and particularly as we learned last year when you're online, you're trying all kinds of things and you're kind of guessing, but it's not always clear what's landing, what's really being helpful. So Paul, I'm wondering, so how do you know when you guys are being successful? How do you know when you've struck something that's really working for students?
Yeah, so a lot of it, as you say, we're sort of data obsessed. We've had lots of teams visiting from Harvard, actually, across the university. Larry has sent people to visit. And so we, as I said, are monitoring constantly. So we now have optics. We offer thousands of sections of thousands of courses every term, given our size. But we can go in now, and I just saw this in the last 6 months, and I was sort of blown away by it. We can go in now and look at any given week in any given course in any given section and see where there's faltering, where something's not happening. And that will get flagged to an academic team, which will then go in and take, like, what's going on? Like, why are these students who are just humming along in week 7, there's a drop off, something's happening here. So part of this is just being able to monitor and know that the data isn't the story, right? The data is the flag. The data says there's a pattern here. And then we have people who are expert in going and sort of tell the story. From a student experience perspective, we do a lot of work around voice of customer. We would say voice of student, but we're always collecting, right? So that is everything from anonymous feedback to focus groups to all of the survey data, but really trying to do, every Friday, I get a report that is a voice of student report. So what question did they look at this week? And it's really been fascinating. And then we work with outside organizations like Ideas 42. Do you know that group?
I do, very well.
Amazing group. I know you would. So they've been helping us look at simple administrative processes, like where you move and frame this question actually has an impact on people's compliance and closure on this. So we're kind of getting at it from every angle and trying to triangulate around the total student experience. And I think you have to keep talking to your students all the time because it's an evolving set of needs over time. And I think where we're not good, and I've really been pushing my team about this, is that we have a dedicated approach, an informed approach for our military students, which are about 18%. So if you're a military advisor, you probably either a veteran or you were in a military family. There's a lot of specialized training. So you know all the acronyms, you can, and you have a kind of authority and genuine sort of relationship because the student veteran on the other side of active military feels like, wait a minute, you know my world.
Right.
We don't do that with our students of color. We have more Native American students than the largest tribal college in the country, and we don't differentiate for them in that way. So we're having a lot of conversation about how do you do that and how do you not assume? How do I not assume that my Native American student wants a Native American advisor? Should I assume that? Probably not. But how do we make, and that extends to culturally informed curriculum. We just did trauma-informed counseling training for hundreds of our advisors because I realized in the middle of a pandemic, there's a lot of trauma. But it's sort of like universal design, right? Like if you do it around the pandemic, it's actually really good training for almost any other kind of trauma, and also knowing where the limits of that are, of course. But that, yeah, I think about this all the time. But data is sort of a foundation of this. but not it's data to inform fundamentally human interactions and understanding.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Because I think I'm sorry, I was gonna say, I think we live in a time when we fetishize data. Like everything is about the data. It's like, actually, I think everything's about the story.
Yeah.
We're trying to get better stories.
I hear you guys being more of a detective, that there's something's going on here, and now we need to talk to people to figure it out. And a theme that you've returned to again and again, and I think that also really framed how we tried to approach remote education, was humanizing.
Yeah.
That even though all this technology is involved, putting the humans first. Which brings me to a question that we've gotten, and this may be particularly relevant given the fact you have 170,000 students. What's the role of AI or machine learning as you're processing all these data and monitoring all these things? Are you using AI and machine learning?
We have a whole working group that's looking at both of those in various applications. So we're doing some of this with VR as well, and some in some pedagogical sort of settings where we're trying to create simulations where we can look at things like ability to work in teams. So it's a simulation where groups of students have to work together, and we can sort of monitor that and take a look at that. So that would be a sort of instructional use of it. We haven't announced this publicly yet, but we have a big project coming up with Google to try to do prior learning assessment through machine learning. So prior learning assessments are still pretty kludgy. And if you think about people learn and bring with them all sorts of skills, can we measure those? Can we know what those are? Can we sort of understand those through machine learning? Because it's a process that for right now, a lot of students don't even bother with because it's so kludgy. Like, I'm going to do a workshop, but you don't actually know, I won't know how many credits I might get till 16 weeks. Oh, never mind. So we're trying to do, some machine learning applications there, certainly on the administrative processing side, using outlying data or joining that with voice bots or chat bots. So Georgia State, for example, as I'm sure you know, has had tremendous success with improving persistence rates among students of color using chatbots for things like Fafsa completion and other administrative processes. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing with this next generation of younger students, as opposed to our like 30 and 35-year-olds, is they don't want to be on phones anymore.
Right.
So we need a different approach to them. Like my 30-year-old kids, like, I'll say to them, have you talked to your 86-year-old grandfather lately? Like, can I just text him? I was like, you met him, right? He's 86. He's got a flip phone if he has a phone at all. No, you have to call him. But they don't want to be on the phone. So we're thinking about ways that we can give people what they need in much faster ways through the use of AI and machine learning.
Excellent, excellent. Paul, this hour has gone by very quickly. We're getting close to the end, but I want to give you a chance for any final words about the book or other things on your mind. And in fact, you have another book coming out next year. Is that right?
I do, and it really was born of this book because this inquiry got me asking the question, how is it that systems that are meant to uplift people so often come to dehumanize the very people they're meant to serve? And we've sort of touched upon this at various points in the conversation. But I then set out to do interviews with people in other industries to think about this. And it's been fascinating because there's so many wonderful examples of systems that are getting it right finally. I'll give you one quick one. It's a Boston-based startup that Chris Gabrielli, who I think may be on this call, sort of turned me on to, but they are working in substance abuse treatment with results that are 2 and 3 times better than the industry norms. But what they realized is that in most of the industry, the medical staff sets the clinical treatment plan for the addicted client or patient. And what they realized is the medical staff gets a few minutes looking at a file, and they're checking boxes and saying, right? But the counselors spend hours with those clients in group sessions. So they actually have shifted the quarterbacking of treatment from the medical staff to the counseling staff, the lowest people on the totem pole, the most relational people on the totem pole. Excuse me, totem pole is an inappropriate word. I just caught myself using it, but in the organizational hierarchy, excuse me. So now all of a sudden you have counselors, a sort of human-centric role driving the work, and the medical staff is brought in as needed for the smaller part. Now, the whole system isn't built to pay for that. Insurance companies don't want to pay for much counseling, but they'll pay over and over again for medical treatment and prescriptions. So what they've been able to show is, no, we can actually have better success and lower costs at scale if you allow us to put people first. And I think it's sort of very much in the theme of this book, right? So I've been looking at industries across the board, and hopefully by sometime next year, I'll be able to pull all that together. But it's very encouraging, actually.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, obviously, there are so many connections between education, healthcare, other services that we have, and I think there's a lot that could be gained as we look across our industries and think about more partnerships. But thank you so much, Paul. So wonderful to have you. I'm going to pass back to my Ann.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.